Hello and welcome to another episode of Knowledge Enthusiast Reacts or Comments On, this time with the sinking of the Titanic from Simple History. And my name is Ossi Eastbourne. I'm 31 years old, former history student without degree, former video game journalist. I was born in East Germany and raised as well as living now in Hamburg. I will pause the video sometimes and then I will give a speech and tell you things that I think are true, and if they aren't, or if I think you could use a lot of extra explanation, then you find it there in the info text box with all the additional information, all the clarification, and as well as corrections. So the sinking of the Titanic is perhaps the most well-known single incident in recent history, as well as far as maritime or passenger transport goes, I think. We all know that in April of 1912, the Titanic, built by the White Star Line, made its maiden fare. Do you call it like that? In German, it's Jungfernfahrt, so it's more or less maiden drive. From I think Southampton or Liverpool or something, with the destination New York, with a stop in I think Belfast. And we all know that they never arrived in New York because they hit an iceberg and sank, with a huge life loss and a shroud of mystery and a loss of very, 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 very rich persons like Jacob Astor the Sixth, I think was it, as well as a lot of poor persons, or not really poor, but third-class persons who didn't make it. And let's just take a look at this video from Simple History. I think, yes, Simple History. And let's see what they have to say.
The sinking of the Titanic, 1912.
I like the voice.
The luxury British passenger liner RMS Titanic began construction on March 31, 1909 in the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland, and was completed 3 years later in 1912. As one of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners, it was designed to be the largest luxury passenger ship in the world and would cost $7.5 million to build.
Funny story, all 3 of the ships should have names that were some kind of Greek. So you had the sister ship was the Olympus, and the other one of them was later known as Britannica, I think, and was sunk in the First World War. And I think the Olympus had some Havaree as well, but didn't sink, and the Titanic, of course, sunk. So at that moment, while the Titanic sank, the 3rd ship was close to finish construction or something like that, and was then renamed. I forgot the name. I will put it in the info text box. But I think I might have. That's what I read, was that this was due to 2 Greek mythological names already being sunk or damaged, and they have seen this as some kind of bad luck, and then renamed the 3rd one. And continue the video.
The passenger ship in the world and would cost $7.5 million to build. It had a length of 882 feet 9 inches, or 269.1 meters, a height of 175 feet, or 53.3 meters, and a width of 92 feet 6 inches, or 28 meters. and it weighed 46,328 tons. Below the waterline was the orlop decks for cargo, and the tank top where the engines, boilers, turbines, and electrical generators were. At the very top was the boat deck, where the bridge and wheelhouse were, as well as the lifeboats.
I'm not exactly sure, but I think the top deck was also divided in the 3 classes, or even only 2 classes. I'm not entirely sure if third-class passengers were allowed on the top deck. But yes, it was a huge ship. It was the biggest ship at that time. It wouldn't be long until the next biggest ship was built, which was, I think, from Blom and Voss in Hamburg. I forgot the name also, but it was then in World War One seized by the British and renamed, but it was at some point the biggest passenger ship in the world. And now, compare it to modern ships, you have even passenger ships today who are even bigger than the Titanic. And even the Titanic was a sight to see when it was in the harbor. With that gigantic measurements and the capacity of transporting like 2,000 to 3,000 people, which was more or less unprecedented at that time. And tell me in the comments if you would have lived in that time and you had the opportunity to go on a trip with Titanic, would you do it? Of course, not knowing what happens, because if you know what happens, then you might say no. But I think this was a dream for many people, even those who were on the richer end of the spectrum, like second class passengers, and especially third class passengers. 2 dreams in one: the dream to going to America and the dream of living in such luxury. I mean, even the third class cabins were comparable to second class on other ships, or even better.
It was the boat deck, where the bridge and wheelhouse were, as well as the lifeboats. In between were the decks for passengers with first, second, and third class cabins. The level of luxury was so high that second class was comparable to first class on any other ship. The 2,240 passengers would be from all walks of life, from millionaires and celebrities to poor immigrants looking for a better life in America. The ship would act like a floating hotel, featuring a grand staircase which allowed first-class passengers to move from deck to deck.
Pretty famous.
And had a domed skylight to allow natural light in. The ship also featured a gymnasium, dining saloons, a reading room, a barber shop, a squash court, a Turkish bath, and a swimming pool.
And there's actually a video game which I think is still in development, but is pretty detailed. It's Titanic, Blood and Steel, Steel and Glory, something like that. I will put the real name here in the info text box, which I played, and which allows you to move the whole Titanic. So you can see the cabins, you can see the restaurants, you can see these giant world famous staircase with the light on top of it, the skylight, and you can walk on deck, you can walk into the Turkish bath, you can walk into the gymnasium and just get a glimpse of how big and how luxurious this ship was. I mean, it even for that time, it was state of the art. It was just a real beauty, with a lot to offer. Think of modern passenger ships, who cruise liners, for example, who have whole malls in it. Which is great and all, but the Titanic was of course they had no whole mall in it, but you could really think of it as what they just said, the swimming hotel. So like the trip was the vacation in that case, for example. Um, you don't even have to leave the ship. It's not really possible, but it's hard. It's hard to put in words what I want to say here. It's just magnificent. Let's just leave it at that.
A squash court, a Turkish bath, and a swimming pool. The ship carried 20 out of a possible 64 lifeboats. Therefore, there were only enough for half the ship's population. However, this was within legal requirements.
And what people often forget, so lifeboat requirements weren't really a thing before the sinking of the Titanic. The Titanic sinking actually made such laws happen, or such self rules that liners would then put on themselves before it became law, that you have enough boats for each and every one on board. So the Titanic had only enough lifeboats for about half of the people there, and even when it sunk, they weren't really filled. But yes, point one, they were within the legal requirements. And point two, they even had more than the legal requirements. I think legally obeyed, they were just to have 12 or something. And they even had more than that, but they didn't want even more because you have to store them somehow, somewhere. And this would lead to some kind of compromise with the luxury and with the view on top of the deck. So they didn't. So there's more space for the passengers to see actually the sea, or the shores if they were near land. But they had more than they legally were required to have.
Enough for half the ship's population. However, this was within legal requirements. Lifeboats were only intended for carrying passengers to rescue ships and not keep the entire ship population afloat. As a result, the company who owned the Titanic, White Star Line, felt complacent enough to keep the number of lifeboats low so the deck wasn't cluttered. Many claimed the Titanic was unsinkable because its hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments. It was said that if up to 4 of these flooded, the ship would still stay buoyant.
Which is partly true. First, if I read it correctly, the White Star Line and the owner and the builder and everyone officially responsible for the Titanic did not make any such claim. No one said that it was unsinkable. It was, I think it was in the media that someone in the press said that it was unsinkable, and the claim for the Titanic to be unsinkable was spread after it sunk. So you know how the press works. You have even then you had clickbait, which is not really clickbait, but you know what I mean. And it would just sell more to say the unsinkable ship sunk, but it was not an official statement from anyone responsible for the Titanic. And one reason for the Titanic being unsinkable was the chambers they had, which indeed would keep the Titanic afloat even if she fills with water. And one of the reasons why she actually sunk was because the damage was too big and it was too many chambers that were damaged. So even if you close the floodgates, that wouldn't help because there is still a hole in the hull. Which brings me to the second point, because the hull was more or less state of the art with I don't know the English word. It's in German. It's Nieten, which is you have metal plates pulled over another and then more or less sealed with not nails. let me just look it up real fast. Rivets. With rivets, and having rivets was another thing that made the Titanic not unsinkable, but unlikely to sink, which that is more or less what the officials said about the Titanic. It's not unsinkable, but it's safe and it's unlikely to sink because of those rivets, because of those plates that are over each other instead of on each other, and because of the chambers and floodgates.
Apartments. It was said that if up to 4 of these flooded, the ship would still stay buoyant. All of these qualities drew the press to frequently talk about the new passenger liner. Disaster.
But like the safety aspect wasn't really the thing that draw the media's attention to it. It was mentioned, and as I said, some outlets did even say it was unsinkable. The real catch of the Titanic is just the luxury. It was and the size. It was the biggest ship at that time. It was the most luxurious ship at that time, and most of the attention afterwards was drawn to the claim of being unsinkable, as well as the life loss, especially those millionaires. And I think, if I read correctly, somewhat about 16% of the world's wealth was on the ship and died or barely survived.
Frequently talk about the new passenger liner. Disaster. In the morning of April 10th, 1912, passengers began boarding the Titanic in Southampton, England, with large crowds gathering to watch the ship depart. At noon, the Titanic set sail under command of Captain Edward Smith, beginning her maiden voyage.
Maiden voyage,
It would
okay.
stop at Cherbourg, France, and then Queenstown, Ireland, to pick up more passengers, and then began its journey across the North Atlantic Ocean towards New York City. On April 14, 1912, warnings were coming in of icebergs from other liners, so Captain Smith had plotted a new course and continued to steam at full speed, which was standard practice.
And to be clear, he even adjusted the course so the Titanic would be more south, because the more north you go, the more likely it is that you would encounter an iceberg. If you go more south, it is less likely because the water is warmer and the air is warmer, and it is pretty hard to catch an iceberg in the Caribbean Sea. Why? Because it's warm. So it's not like he went that far south, but he went further south than the original route was intended. And there's also these hard grabbing myth. And with hard grabbing, I mean it's a myth that came around that time even, and is still around today, and still some people who believe it, was that the Titanic wanted to win the Blue Band. If you don't know what the Blue Band is, the Blue Band was an honor, I think it was, I don't know if it is still given today, for fastest transatlantic crossing. So the fastest ship to go from Europe to America. And at that time, it was like, 4 days and some hours. And there was a rumor that the Titanic went so fast because they wanted to win these Blue Band. But this rumor is alone by the fact that they adjusted the course to be more south, meaning less utility or usage of the Earth curve, which is why normally you go, when you go from Britain to New York, you go this way, which is the shortest way you can go. If you go this way, then you have a longer way, so you need more time. And as they just said, it was common practice to go faster because I think one of the reasons to go faster was that similar to when you have a deer on the road, then you should go faster, because then it's more likely that the deer wouldn't damage your car so much. And I think the same reasoning was with icebergs. I don't know. I don't know the exact reasoning why it was like that, but I could imagine that it had something to do with being faster means that you are less likely to take real damage or something like that. But it was not to win this blue band.
A new course and continued to steam at full speed, which was standard practice. As it became dark, the temperatures were dropping to below freezing, and there was no moonlight or waves, making it difficult to see approaching icebergs. At 11:40 p.m. ship's time, the ship's lookout, Frederick Fleet, spotted an iceberg from the crow's nest. He rang the warning bell and telephoned the officers at the ship's bridge, shouting, "Iceberg right ahead." Fleet had spotted the iceberg with his eyes, as the crow's nest binoculars were locked away. The key's owner, Officer David Blair, had been removed from the Titanic's crew at the last minute and forgot to hand over the key.
Yeah, this is one of the most famous stories of history, I think. I even saw other videos about this. And this I think it was the third officer, or was meant to be the third officer on ship, but was replaced, I think, one day before the maiden voyage. And he had the key to the lock where the binoculars were in. And at least that's how the story goes. As far as I know, this was one of the men in the crow's nest would survive the sinking of the Titanic and would later on be trialed, because there was a trial and all officers who survived were trialed and should explain their actions, should explain what happened. And one of those in the crow's nest mentioned that they did not have binoculars because they didn't have the key. Of course, in retrospective, you could just say, okay, why didn't they break open the locker and get the binoculars out, or just slam the window if it had one? But this is what you think in retrospective. At their perspective, they would just get a new key when they arrive in New York. No need. They did not knew that they would ram an iceberg because they were missing binoculars. And even if that's another thing about the Titanic, like you just said, it was a dark night without waves. So even if you had binoculars, it is not entirely sure if you could have spotted the iceberg earlier, because it's still dark, and binoculars at that time did not have a night vision. So maybe even it would be even more unlikely to see it. Maybe they would have seen it a little bit earlier, but it's debatable. It's really debatable if the binoculars would have helped. But it's, as I said, one of the history's famous stories that they were actually missing.
Blair had been removed from the Titanic's crew at the last minute and forgot to hand over the key. The officers on the bridge quickly turned the ship away from the iceberg, but it was too late. The Titanic grazed the iceberg along its side, ripping several holes in its hull below the waterline, with fragments of ice hitting the deck. At first, everyone felt relief. The lookouts and the passengers didn't even feel the collision. 11:50 p.m.
Yeah, and they did make an attempt to get past the iceberg, and which brings us now to many factors that played a role. The first thing that I learned when I went to the Titanic Museum was that the top of an iceberg is not the whole iceberg. The most of the iceberg is underwater, and especially at night you can't see underwater. And so they, while atop of the water, they might have thought that they did not hit the iceberg, which was accompanied by the fact that it was only a minor rumble that went on. But underwater, It is believed that the iceberg was not even bigger in size, but also had some pointy end, which is what exactly hit the Titanic and ripped it open, which is one factor. The other factor is that, and I don't remember if maybe I'm just confusing ships right now, but if I remember correctly, there was a little bit of uncertainty about the Titanic with the direction in which to steer the rudder. So you have Starboard and you have the other one. In German, it's Steuerbord und Backbord. And the definition of Starboard, which is left, I don't know. I am not a sailor, and which is one direction. But it has if you learned how to sail in an earlier time, it was the other direction than what it meant if you learned it later. And since the officers, like the captain at that point was asleep, and Murdoch, the first officer, was, if I remember correctly, responsible for the maneuver, and he learned how to sail earlier than the man on the actual rudder. So the story goes that they misinterpreted what he meant. So he said starboard, and they then put the rudder to what they thought was starboard, but it was the opposite direction of what Murdoch meant with starboard, which is one explanation that I heard. If I don't switch ships or confuse ships, the other one is what was later on deemed as fatal for the Titanic was that they ordered a full retreat. So they were on full speed, and as soon as they approached the iceberg, they would go on full retreat. So they would not only stop the machines, but put them in reverse, which first takes time, and second does not really slow you immediately because you have the momentum, and at third would also interfere with the direction in which the rudder goes. So as you know, when you drive in a car and you drive backwards, you have to steer in the opposite direction that you would when you drive forward, which you also would have to do if on a ship, if you go in full retreat. Also, I think what I once read was that if they would just go at full speed, then they would not only not be that much damaged by the iceberg, because it would maybe just shrapnel off or repel off the hull, or make minor damage in maybe only one section, but they would also, even with the damage they had, be able to get further. So there were many factors at play here that the Titanic would sink, and as we all know, the ship stopped, which made it even easier for the water to get in.
Passengers didn't even feel the collision. 11:50 p.m. Captain Smith and the ship architect, Thomas Andrews, went to inspect the damage. They knew the ship would start sinking, and by this time, 6 of the watertight compartments at the front of the ship's hull were already breached and began flooding. 12 a.m. The captain sent out a distress call over the radio in the hopes that there were other ships nearby, and gave the order for the Titanic's passengers to board the lifeboats. He knew there were only enough for half the population of the Titanic. At 12:25, the lifeboats began their loading, with women and children first, as this was the protocol at sea.
Here it is important that they afterwards they distinguish between both the left and the right side of the boat. So on one side, First Officer Murdoch had oversight over the the boats, and on the other side it was, I think, the second officer. And one of them, I think the second officer, was really, really strict with only women and only children, whereas Murdoch was more lenient and said, okay, women and children as long as we get some. And then to fill up the boats, men, of course, as well. And so you had your chance of survival depended more or less on what side you were. And these women and children first policy, which wasn't really a law, which was just a custom for quite some years now. I think it started somewhere in the 19th century with some steamliner or something. Is one of the reasons why most of the children and most of the women that were aboard survived, whereas about, what was it, 90% of men died, or 85% or something, and the percentage is even worse in third class, because almost everyone in third class died, especially men. And yeah, it was very, very sad, I would say. And another problem was that most of the people thought it would only be a drill. Even some of the officers thought it would just be a drill. So people would not really get on deck. There was no haste, because they saw that they didn't think that the Titanic was really sinking. Only when it was more or less too late, and either the water was high enough for them to see it actually, or the boat was has sunken enough with the front for them to actually see, okay, this ship is sinking. And this is again one of the reasons why the first boats were put into the water with much less persons in it than later boats, which were sometimes even overfilled, more or less. And yeah, so there was so much at play that night that made this catastrophe such catastrophic. That's just yeah. I mean, you see, even in this picture, you can imagine that's not even half of what the boat's capacity would be. And of course, one member of the crew would accompany almost every boat.
Boats began their loading, with women and children first, as this was the protocol at sea. Many passengers still did not understand what was going on, and confusion and disorganization meant that the first lifeboat to leave had only 28 women and children aboard, when it could carry 65 people.
Yeah, that's not even half. And they weren't even really concerned at that point. Another factor that made it so devastating was that, if I remember correctly, the telegraph line that the boat had was more or less only used for private telegraphs. So people's private messages would be sent to New York or back to England. And even when the telegrapher got the message that the ship is sinking and he should telegraph a distress signal, he ordered it after the passengers' signals he had to send first. If he had sent it earlier, maybe a ship would be on the point earlier and able to pick up more people which might still live. But as we all know, I think Catalina was the first ship that arrived there in the next morning, like 6 hours after the Titanic sunk, when only those in the boats were still alive, more or less.
To leave had only 28 women and children aboard, when it could carry 65 people. First Officer Murdoch took the order to mean women and children first, then men if they were there. while Second Officer Lightoller took it to mean women and children only.
Yeah.
The Carpathia, which was 58 miles away, heard the distress call and began sailing towards the sinking Titanic
Carpathia,
to
okay.
rescue the passengers. Distress flares were shot into the sky to help locate the sinking Titanic. By 1 a.m., with the lower decks flooding, the bow of the ship began to sink below the...
I think there's also this I think it's just a rumor. Was it real that the light flares that they only had one or something like that, and weren't able to shoot more? So the Catalina, I already forgot the name again, wasn't really able to locate them. And there's also this rumor that another ship was pretty much closer to the Titanic, so close even that they could communicate via light signals, but did not help and did not see it as a distress signal, which is also very catastrophic. I think it was only something like 6 miles away or something, and they got the signal, but I think it's highly debated if it was really there and if it could really have helped and stuff like that. I will put it in the info text box because I think the Catalina, the Sea Point was the closest ship that would actually go there, and I think in reality it also was the closest ship, but I am not sure. I will put it in the box.
By 1 a.m., with the lower decks flooding, the bow of the ship began to sink below the water's surface. Water was pouring in 15 times faster than it could be pumped out, which was not helped by the fact that many of the passengers had left their portholes open. The unsupported stern and its propellers rose out of the water into the air.
Yeah. Now we have one construction mistake by the shipbuilders and one mistake by the people. The mistake by the shipbuilders was, as far as I know, I don't know if it's a rumor or if it's true, but what I read was that these waterproof chambers with the water flooding gates and stuff like that were not sealed to the top. So like if the Titanic sinks and it sinks with the front first, which it does, then the water, even if the gates are closed, would just swap over and go that way into the next chamber and so on and so on and so on. And but like I said, I really don't know. But more crucial for the speed in which the Titanic sinks, because you can't stop the sinking now. Even if you now would go full speed, you see the thingies are in the air, so you would have no forward momentum. And as I said, the passengers were not aware of what is even happening, and they thought it was just a drill, so many of them left their windows open, and as soon as the ship reached the water level with those windows, they would flood as hell as quick as possible and even let the Titanic sink faster. So, as I said, so many things went wrong in that night.
The unsupported stern and its propellers rose out of the water into the air.
Yes.
Panic and chaos set in as lifeboats were running out. Some people pushed their way to the lifeboats, while others accepted their fate and stayed behind or gave up their spots to more vulnerable passengers. Many did not want to survive the disaster.
According to legend, the musicians did say something like, "We will go down like gentlemen" or something, and their intention to continue play music was to, like you just said, there was the people were panicking because now they would really see that the Titanic is sinking, and their life is in danger because even if they could swim, the water is ice cold. When I went to the museum, then there was these. I think it was a replica of an iceberg, but next to it was a picture with hand marks in the iceberg because some people would try to grab on the ice because it is some kind of land, but it's also ice. It's freaking cold, especially if you are in the water, and yeah. It's just unimaginable to be in such situation. But yeah, as there were this panic, the musicians are set to wanting to calm the people and to at least die with dignity. And yes, it's also believed that the ship's builder, or was it the builders, that some people would just, old people would just stay in their beds and die together, and then rich people would also stay. I think the previously mentioned Jacob Astor would have got to a lifeboat, but he cleared his seat for a second or third class passenger, as well as his wife, so they both died, I guess. But I'm not entirely sure. I will put it in the info text box. Someone even cleared his seat, and because he was older or something like that. Yeah.
Or gave up their spots to more vulnerable passengers. Many did not want to survive the disaster and be branded a coward back home. By 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat had left, but 1,500 people were left on the ship.
I would rather be a coward than that.
The deck was now at a steep height, and many passengers fell into the freezing, icy waters. At 2:17 a.m., the captain announced, "Every man for himself." The stern gave way under the pressure and broke off, with the front half disappearing to the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, every man for himself is means that in case of an emergency, in case of a ship sinking, then the protocol more or less is to retain organized and retain civilized as long as possible. When the captain gives the order, every man for himself, that means every hope is lost, and you are more or less forgiven in the eyes of gods if you now do things that would be under normal circumstances be viewed as bad. In order to survive. So it's just every protocol is now abolished, and just try to survive by any means, even if that means you would have to use others as a float more or less, or to damage the ship even more. Yeah, but in reality, it's not gonna work because there is no lifeboat left. There is no hope left. You can grab on maybe a door, but still the water is cold. You can maybe other wooden things. You have life vests, but those don't help if the water is below zero. At least, I mean, not really below zero, because then it would be ice, but you know what I mean. The air is below zero. The water is like 4 degrees. And there is no hope left. And famously, Captain Smith did go down with his ship, as it was not custom yet. So today the protocol is, I think, that captain goes down with its ship. At that time, it's like women and children first. It's not really a real custom yet.
Under the pressure and broke off, with the front half disappearing to the bottom of the ocean. At some point, Captain Smith went down with the ship, a maritime tradition that the captain would do in accepting responsibility for all on board. Some say he went to the wheelhouse and waited for the end, while others say he committed suicide using a pistol. The
This is,
stern,
I think, what
smashing
Murdoch
into
did.
the water's surface, became level and soon started to fill with water, sinking nearly 4 kilometers beneath the surface of the ocean. Many died as a result of drowning, but the main cause of death was hypothermia in the freezing waters, which occurred within minutes. Some of the lifeboats returned, but only 4 survivors were found.
And they returned pretty late. I think the first lifeboat that returned was the one with, if you have seen the movie Titanic, then you know of Rosie O'Donnell's, is it Rosie O'Donnell? Kathy Bates. Sorry, Kathy Bates. You know of Kathy Bates' role, the unsinkable Betty, I think, is Becky? Unsinkable Becky? I don't know. But her role actually in the sinking of the Titanic was actually pretty huge, and she would even threat with a mutiny on her lifeboat if they would not return. I think they were the first to return, or they did never return, but overthrow the officer anyway, or something like that. But yeah, only a few did return. I mean, there were 20 lifeboats with 19 of them even surviving. Just one was breaking down or something, or was going on its head, which will happen later, or which happened after it was put into the water. But yeah, and if some would even tie together to even have more space and more stability, especially because the main fear of the officers to going back was if there were really people alive, they would maybe try to panically went into the boat and then would bring it to canter, if that's the English word, to yeah, roll over. And they were afraid of that, which was a real possibility and might even be the reason why one of the boats actually did roll over and was unusable afterwards. Except from I think only 1 or 2 were clinging to it with their last strength. So yeah, there's that.
In minutes. Some of the lifeboats returned, but only 4 survivors were found. At 3:30 a.m., the distress flares from the Titanic were spotted by the Carpathia. The Carpathia arrived to the scene at 4:10 a.m. and picked up the lifeboats.
So only like 2-3 hours after the Titanic sunk. Was it at 2:10 or 1:10 when it sunk? When it was gone for good? I don't know.
The Carpathia arrived to the scene at 4:10 a.m. and picked up the lifeboats. Only 705 passengers would survive the disaster.
This is the headline of some newspapers. I just saw it today when I was watching a video with historical pictures from I think 1820 to 2019, and the picture for 1912 was actually a newspaper boy with the newspaper with Titanic disaster, great loss of life, which was actually the headline. And yeah, he was just mentioning how many died, but it was a lot. It was, like I said, what was it, like 60%, 70% of passengers and crew, with one crew member even. There was one crew member that was previously on the Olympic when it had his crash, then on the Titanic, survived, and then on the Britannica, even when it sunk in the Mediterranean, and was then hit by a propeller when she fall down the ship. She fall on the propeller, or the propeller fall on her, something like that, something with the propeller. But she even survived that and lived a happy life after. But yeah, she was on all 3 Olympic class ships when they had their haveries.
Titanic were spotted by the Carpathia. The Carpathia arrived to the scene at 4:10 a.m. and picked up the lifeboats. Only 705 passengers would survive the disaster, with over 1,500 people losing their lives. Subscribe and click the notification bell for more history videos.
Okay, I should have waited. Okay, yeah, that was Simple History's sinking of the Titanic of 1912. Yeah, it like I said, it was probably the thing is, the sinking of the Titanic was more or less forgotten in the years between. It was only made popular again when the actual wreckage was found. I think in the 80s and early 90s or something, and when then some kind of cult would start around the Titanic, which had its peak when the movie came out. There were some minor movies even before that, like if you ever seen the Orange, these TV show about this Ossi California. That's what it's called. The surrogate father of Brian, which is the main adult person in the series, is has played a role in another Titanic movie. I think even that Tim Curry played a role in a Titanic movie or something. There were even some movies like Titanic 2, but they were not that popular. The Titanic movie with Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio made the whole story about the Titanic popular, really, really popular again, and helped it climb to its rise of popularity that it has today. Today, it's over 100 years in the past, and it's studied to death, but still we do not know everything. And today, from today's perspective, it's one of the biggest single events in recent history, meaning in the last 150 years, at least for the West, I think. But yeah, that was Sinking of the Titanic. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then please leave me a like and subscribe. The link to the original video you will find in the description. Yeah, if you don't like it, then please dislike if you want, and tell me why, and tell me why you liked when you like, maybe, or just tell me what do you think about the video, what do you think about my channel, what do you think should I do next. And yeah, with that I will leave you, but I already know what I do next. Oh, sorry. The next video will be in about 2 days, I hope. As I said, I will put out a video every second day if I manage to do so. I think right now I can do so. So expect in 2 days, if you watch this right when it comes out, the video about what if the Central Powers would have won World War I, which is a pretty interesting topic. And as long as that is not public, stay around and maybe watch the other videos I did. You will find 2 of them right now, right here. Goodbye.